What is the voltage effect? Why do some ideas fail while others change the world? What are the 5 hurdles one must clear to ensure the vitality of an idea? And why should policymakers move from evidence-based policy to policy-based evidence? I'll explore these questions and so much more with Professor John A. List, author of The Voltage Effect and an economist at the University of Chicago. So, John, what is scalability, and why is it such an important concept to grasp today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want you to think about scalability as I do original research in, say, the Petri dish or in a community, and I want to know, will the impacts that I find in the Petri dish, if I scale the program up, and what I mean by scale up is I go to multiple cities or a very, very big setting, will I receive the exact same impact from my program that I found I was receiving in the Petri dish? That's the way I think about scalability. Now, ideas with good scalability end up having the same impact or even more, and ideas that don't have such good scalability will end up having what I call voltage drops. So it looked great in the Petri dish, but it wasn't so great when we scaled it up.
I was wondering, you point out that all too often the promising ideas collapse at scale, and that these cases are all examples, as you just said, of voltage drop. What do you mean by that term? And to what extent, John, is the title of your book, The Voltage Effect, about the science of scaling?
Sure. I think that's a great question, Michael. So the way I think about the book, The Voltage Effect, it's a description of what happens to the impact of our ideas when we go from the small to the large. And you're exactly right that in many cases, there are voltage drops. And what that means is, look great in the Petri dish, not so great when we scale it up. But occasionally, there are ideas where you have voltage gains. And what that means is it looked good in the Petri dish, but it was even better when we scaled it. Now, I became interested in this about 10 years ago, and I started to look into this notion of scaling. And I looked for science. And what I mean by that is I looked for what is our scientific understanding of scaling. And what I basically found was a lot of art. And what I mean by art is, in the business world, it's along the lines of move fast and break things, or fake it till you make it. Now, this is art because there is literally no data behind it. And in many cases, it's faulty reasoning. So I began a research agenda writing academic papers wherein I essentially attempted to add the economic science to scaling. And it's what I call the science of using science.
So, John, you point out that certain ideas are predictably scalable while others are predictably unscalable, and that scalability is a fragile concept. What are the 5 hurdles one has to overcome in order to have a scalable idea?
Sure. So it all starts with, does your idea have voltage? And what I mean by that is there really an effect of your program? And this goes down the path of identifying whether your idea is a false positive. And the way I want you to think about false positive is you take a COVID test, and sometimes it comes back and tells you you're COVID positive, but that might be a false positive. So that's what we're talking about in the first vital sign is, take care to make sure that your idea is not a false positive. Vital sign number 2 is understand your audience. And what I mean by that is understand which types of people your program works for, who it works for. And in many cases in this vital sign, we exaggerate or overestimate how many people our idea will actually help, because we make systematic errors in how we gather evidence early on in our process of trying to learn about our idea. So vital sign number 2 is know your audience. Vital sign number 3, I titled this part of the book, is it the chef or is it the ingredients? And the idea is make sure that when you generate the very first evidence about the efficacy of your idea, make sure that there aren't unique situational elements that are causing it to work in the Petri dish, but when you try to scale it up, those unique features are no longer present. And in those cases, you will have a dramatic voltage drop because the elements that made it work in the Petri dish in the small were just not available in the large. So that's vital sign number 3, is understand the unique elements in which you're gathering your data early on. Vital sign number 4 is spillovers. And this was a fun chapter to write because spillovers are multidimensional. And I go all the way back to the 1960s when Ralph Nader talked about traffic fatalities. And he talked about how dangerous our automobiles were when we're out driving on the highway and killing each other. In that case, they mandated seatbelts. The federal government did in 1968. And some economists came along, one in particular named Sam Peltzman comes along and finds that new seatbelt mandate actually had no effect on traffic fatalities. And it was simply because people who were wearing seatbelts drove more aggressively when they had the seatbelt on. So that's one kind of spillover. And I talk about 3 other major kinds of spillovers. And what this chapter really is about is to understand that when you have an idea, there will naturally be spillovers, some of them good, some bad, and you need to understand those before you scale. Now, vital sign number 5 is what I call the supply side of scaling. And this is simply to look at whether your idea has economies of scale or whether it has diseconomies of scale. And that will importantly affect whether you have a voltage drop. Because remember, in government policy making or in the business world, we're always about benefits and costs. We do benefit cost analysis. So even if the benefit profile doesn't drop at scale, you can still have a voltage drop if the supply side ends up failing you, if you have diseconomies of scale. Okay, Michael, so those are the 5 vital signs.
So, I want to delve a little deeper, John, into for an idea to scale. You point out something I think is very important. Why is it critical for you to know the negotiables versus the non-negotiables, and then figure out whether your non-negotiable ingredients are in fact scalable? Why is that so important?
Exactly. I'm glad you touched on this, Michael, because to me, this is the biggest mistake that governments make today, is that they are generating data to the wrong questions. Okay, here's what I mean by that. If you want to change the world as a government, you have to change it at scale. What that means is you have to generate data in a manner that is consistent with what happens at scale. This is something that I call policy-based evidence. Okay, let me unpack all of that. So I lead off this chapter with an example that's titled, Is it the chef or is it the ingredients? So I look at a lot of restaurant data, and there are a lot of restaurants that try to scale. And what I mean by that is they have one restaurant and they're killing it. And let's say that one restaurant is earning $1 million in profits every year. So the entrepreneur says, well, why not have 50 of them? We can make $50 million a year. And they give it a go and they try to scale. They try to turn from one restaurant to say 50 restaurants or 25 restaurants, whatever. Invariably, what happens is if the secret sauce was the chef, what I'm saying here is if the initial success of the first restaurant is because of the chef, that restaurant will never scale. And it's because unique humans don't scale. So the moral of this story is understand early on what are your negotiables, what are your non-negotiables. So if it's the chef, that means it's the chef is the non-negotiable. So that means I don't want to scale that up until I can make sure at scale I can get the same kinds of chefs. As it turns out, when you're trying to emulate a unique human, it just doesn't work. And it's nearly impossible to teach it because that's why they're unique. Now, think about my pre-K program that I started in Chicago Heights back in 2010. One of the non-negotiables there was the teacher. So I had to hire 30 teachers for my pre-K program in Chicago Heights. And what I found was if you want to think about scaling then, hiring 30 teachers is a lot different than hiring 30,000 teachers around Chicago. You can see why, right? It's easy to hire 30 good teachers, but it's nearly impossible to hire 30,000 good teachers. So that tells me before I scale my preschool, I have to make sure that I have a curriculum and I have a program that will work with the types of teachers that I can hire at scale. What you've just done is you've given us an answer to a question of if you use the best inputs in the Petri dish, does your idea work? That's what you've just answered. You haven't answered if I scale this idea and I have to take the warts and the constraints and all of the problems at scale and said, now does the idea work? We haven't answered that question, Michael. We have answered the wrong question with our research approach. And that's because of the manner in which we've set up the academy. The intellectual knowledge creation market is set up to do an efficacy test and to get the best publication and to get the headlines in the New York Times and then to leave. And then you forget to tell everyone, hey, by the way, that was an efficacy test. Don't expect it to work at scale because then nobody will listen to you if you say that. But that's the truth. You're coming up with a solution to the wrong question. And until we embrace the fact that we have to bring all of the warts, all of the constraints, all of the issues that we're going to face at scale, we need to bring those back to the Petri dish. And that's what I call policy-based evidence.
John, what are some of the cost problems inherent to scaling?
Business people tend to start there for two reasons. One, they understand that as they grow, the very early consumers might be really, really interested in the product and they will pay a lot of money. But as you grow, you also have to take in customers who are willing to pay a little bit less and a little bit less money. And in those cases, that means to continue to make a lot of profit or enough profit, you want to be able to take care of the supply side and produce the good at a lower and lower cost. So that's one reason why business people care about this first and foremost. The second reason is it's a competitive advantage. And what I mean by that is if you get really, really big, the new person coming in or the entrant has to start from stage one. And it's very hard for them to compete because you're at a really, really low cost per unit. And that makes it very hard for them to compete with your prices. So that's kind of another reason why businesses, whether it's Musk or Bezos or Travis Kalanick or whomever, they're interested first and foremost, what does the supply side look like? And then let's see if I can make a demand side. On the government side, it's altogether different. It's really interesting, Michael. On the government side, they start and pretty much stay with the benefit side. They say, what does a benefit profile look like? Who does it help? What is the equity in terms of, does it help one group and not another? These are important, no doubt. And you should always concern yourself with which groups are being helped. And the ones who aren't being helped, you should come up with solutions for them too. But the interesting aspect is most of the discussion on the government or the public side is on the benefit profile. And I think it's in part because, let's face it, the federal government is a monopoly and they don't face competition. So when you don't face competition and you face a world whereby you are essentially graded on the benefits that people are getting. And in fact, if you're a state senator or a congressperson from New York, you want to bring in benefits for your constituents. Makes sense. You're focusing on the benefit side. And that's a really interesting disconnect that I learned in my research. But nonetheless, it's still, cost, of course, is still important. When I worked in the federal government, we did a lot of benefit cost analyses. But what we didn't do a lot of is try to forecast what the cost would look like at scale. And that was because, by and large, we didn't care as much in the government. Now, maybe they do it today, but I'm just saying back in 2003, we didn't focus on the forecasting of the cost as the program scaled.
This has been a special edition of the Business of Government Hour, a conversation with authors, focusing on how to make good ideas great and great ideas scale, with Professor John A. List, author of The Voltage Effect. Be sure to join us next time for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government leadership and its effectiveness. Until then, subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at Podcast One, iTunes, or on your favorite podcast app. And as always, at businessofgovernment.org.